Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the course of English for Academic Communication with me, Maria Dewi Rosari from Jakarta International University. Welcome to week 11 and lecture 11. We are 2 lectures away from the end of this course. And in these last 2 lectures, we have our last topic. So as I said earlier that in every 2 meetings or every 2 lectures, we are actually discussing the same topic, but with different focus. So in this week 11 and also 12, as you can see in the syllabus that I already made for you, we are talking about academic talk, right? But for this week 11, we are going to talk about teaching demonstration. We are focusing on teaching demonstration with a further focus on challenges and strategies. And then in week 12, we are still dealing with another academic talk, but we are no longer dealing with teaching demonstration, but different settings of academic talks like that. Okay, before we see the material for week 11, let's find out the learning objectives of this lecture 11. So the learning objectives, as usual, are written on the right side of slide 2. So the first one is that we have 4 main parts or 4 big groups or 4 sections in this lecture 11. And the sections are, number 1 is unit introduction. So I always start every lecture with unit introduction. It's like a introduction itself. I'd like to introduce you about what this unit, what this lecture is going to be about, and you know what to expect. You know what to learn and what is expected from you. So although you are using this material as your self-study, you know what to do, how to do it, and how to measure your success as well. And then in section number 2, it's the same was a section as you have found in the previous lectures. It's about facing challenges and exploring hidden assumptions. So in this section, I will provide you with several diagnostic questions to help you analyze and reflect on your own experience regarding the topic we are discussing. And in this case, in lecture 11, it's about teaching demonstration. After that, we are moving to section number 3. It's about mastering the mechanisms of language with a focus of functional language for delivering a teaching demonstration. We have 3 subsections in this section 3, which are the introduction of your lecture. So when we just started our lecture, how to introduce our lecture, what to say and what to do. And then in the second subsection, we have the body of your lecture. So after we open it, after we introduce the topic of our lecture, we need to deliver the body of our lecture or the main menu of our lecture, and how to do it and what to do, what to say are the ones we are going to discuss in 3.2. And the last subsection in session 3 is about the conclusion of your lecture. So was that we are going to see how to conclude or how to close our lecture, right? So we opened and then the content and the closing, like that. And then we are going to discuss about basics of effective language use as well. And the last one, number 4, it's about challenges and strategies for teaching demonstration. There must be a lot of challenges and strategies in our teaching or our teaching demonstration. And in this section 4, we are going to focus more on tips for overcoming speech anxiety. It's going to be a good discussion, especially for those who haven't had a lot of experience in talking in front of public, like that. So how to overcome speech anxiety, what to do, what to prepare before the show time, right? So that we can minimize our anxiety. All right, so that's about the learning objectives. Now let's start our lesson. in week 11 about teaching demonstration. Okay, before we go to the very first section, I'd like to ask you several questions. So you may write the answers down in your note, as you know, to help you track your learning progress, or you want to take notes in your phone or any gadget that you have, or you want to just remember it in your mind, that's fine. But I'd recommend you to write it down, so that one day when you want to or need to review what you have learned so far about English for academic communication, you know what you have done so far, and you can see your reflection, because the questions in this slide is actually helping to reflect on the experience that we have had so far. Okay, and here are the questions. So what can be the most challenging moment for a teacher when teaching in a classroom? Is it the students? Is it the material? Is it the delivery of the material, or something else? If you have had experience of teaching in front of a class, then you can answer this question from your experience, from your perspective. But if you haven't had any experience in teaching, don't worry. It doesn't mean that you cannot answer that. You can recall your memory when you are having a class with any lecturers of your choice, and then try to remember the event or what happened in the class, right? So as you observe your lecturers or your professors or your teachers, your instructors, what do you see as the most challenging moment for your teacher or professor? Is it related to the students, or is it the material? Is it the delivery of the material, or is it something else about the class? Like that, for example, something else is like about the classroom setting or the sitting of the students. There are so many factors, right? So it's up to you. You can answer it from your own experience or from the experience of other teachers that you observe, right? Please be specific as possible. If you think the most challenging moment comes from different aspects, for example, a challenging moment from the student or challenging moment from the material delivery, so more than one side, that's fine. You can describe all of them like that. Write it down on slide 3, or you can just write down your answers in your notebook. Do not go to the next slide before you finish answering these questions, but whenever you are finished, let's go to the next slide, and we are going to enter the very first section. I will introduce you with a unit for this lecture. The final unit that covers lecture 11 and 12 introduces you to speaking situations at conferences, job talks, and interviews. This unit builds on the abilities to express opinions and respond to questions in interpersonal, group, and teaching settings that you have developed in previous units. These abilities are highly applicable to presenting at conferences, delivering research talks, giving teaching demonstrations, and speaking during job interviews. Well, in here, what is stated is teaching demonstrations, but it doesn't mean that the material or the methods of the language are only applicable to teaching demonstration, but not in the real teaching. So it can be applicable to many situations, even in non-teaching setting, like that. Just in case that you are wondering what teaching demonstration is, it's like you are applying for a job, a teaching job in an educational institution, and after you submit the documents and they respond your application and ask you to demonstrate how well you are in teaching. So you have to demonstrate your teaching, right? Demonstrate your teaching in front of maybe the HR staff that will act as your students. So you give a demo about your teaching skills. So that's teaching demonstrations, right? And the materials that we are covering today are applicable for both the demonstration or the real teaching situations, right? And for the research talks and job interviews and presenting at the conferences are there for lecture 11, but are still covered in the same unit, this final unit for lecture 11 and 12. The recurring key components in this lecture 11, which include facing challenges and exploring hidden assumptions, mastering the mechanics of language, and strategies for success, are designed with the main focus on developing your confidence and competence in communicating with mixed, diverse, or unknown audience members in fielding challenging or anticipated questions. So sometimes one of the most challenging thing for a teacher is not only about how to handle the students during the teaching or how to do the material delivery well, but it can also be about teaching a new class. I myself find it challenging to teach in the very first meeting with a new class because I haven't met the students before. I don't know their competence. I don't know their background knowledge yet, so I cannot really map the skill and the knowledge of my students. So I sometimes find it I find myself nervous in the very first meeting of teaching a new class like that, but the second meeting and the third meeting it will be way easier. That's why I asked you in the ice-breaking slide, what do you think will be the most challenging from your experience or from the experience of other teachers? The strategies for success section that we will see in this lecture includes questions and tips for controlling speech anxiety. Well, actually, there are a lot of tips that we need in the teaching, but we will focus more on controlling speech anxiety. The time is now to start preparing and practicing the delivery of the types of talks mentioned in this unit. Finally, don't take rejections personally. Treat every challenge as an opportunity for learning and for personal and professional growth. What does it mean? So, if you're really into teaching and when you're applying for a teaching job, you may send applications to different institutions, right? Some of them may reject you, while some others may respond and continue the application process with you. Whenever you are rejected, whenever we are rejected, we don't need to take it personally, but take it as a lesson for our growth as a personal and a professional human being. And it is now the time to prepare and practice the materials for the teaching demonstration, because our focus is teaching demonstration. So that's about what this final unit is about and what is expected from you, and also the further explanations about each section that we are having today. Now let's start the second section about facing challenges and exploring your assumptions. Be ready to have a deeper reflection on the experience you have had so far. Okay, let's go. Facing challenges and exploring hidden assumptions. Explore these questions on your own if you use this material for self-study. If you are in a classroom or using this as a classroom instruction, share your thoughts about these questions with a speaking partner and be prepared to share your discussion with the class. Well, actually, if you're using this for self-study, you can ask your best friend, your friend to be your sharing partner, right? And the questions are, number one, share with your speaking partners how you feel about your ability to answer questions during question and answer sessions in teaching. So we are being very specific here, which is about handling question and answer sessions in teaching, not in a conference, not in a meeting, right? What challenges have you encountered or would you anticipate encountering? What cross-cultural factors might come into play in this context? Together, brainstorm strategies that you can use when fielding questions. So first, this question will ask you the challenges that you have had or the challenges that you think you need to anticipate will happen in the next teaching session of yours, like that? And do you think there is like cultural factor that influence the occurrence of questions in your teaching? And then what can be the strategies to handle this issue? And then question number 2, building challenging teaching situation. Building on the previous lectures where you explored how you would handle situations and challenging questions that you may encounter in your teaching, explore with your speaking partners some strategies that you can use to handle the following challenging issues. Be sure to consider both the strategies. For example, how would you deal with the situation? And also the language. What would you say exactly that you can use when handling each of the following situations? Work in pairs and write down what you would say for each situation. So I will provide you with several situations, and please, analyze and describe what would you say and what would you do. So it's about your strategies and the language you're going to use. Situation number 1. Those who like to shake their heads negatively at whatever you or other students are saying. In this kind of situation, what would you do and what would you say? What kind of expression you will say to that kind of student? And then what would you do? What would you do? Reverse to your action. Will you invite the students outside of the class and then have a one-on-one talk with the student to find out the real issue? Or do you have something else to do? Situation number 2, those who like to ask a hostile question. Well, no one will expect or want to face this kind of questions, but we cannot control our students, right? They may come up with a hostile question. So if you are really facing this kind of situation, what do you think you would do and you would say? That's situation number 2. And then situation number 3, those who like to ask a personal or confidential question. Sometimes students find it hard to find the boundaries between personal and non-personal questions, maybe because they are feeling very comfortable with you as an instructor, so they try to approach you with personal or confidential question, right? Because maybe they are just curious, or maybe they want to be closer to you. If you happen to face that kind of situation, what would you do and what would you say? Take your time to finish answering those questions, pause this video and stay on slide 8 as long as you need. Next one, situation number 4, which is no question. Well, in a country whose culture is like mine, no question situations often happens, because sometimes students are too shy to speak in front of forum or raising hand like that, or they just don't want to be seen as someone that speaks a lot like that. That's related to culture. It can be related to culture. So when our students come up with no question at all in a Q&A, it doesn't mean that they didn't pay attention to any of our lecturing, but it can also be related to the cultural factors, right? I hope you still remember the material in lecture 1, right? About the cultural factors that may come into play in our teaching. So if you still have a lot of time in your teaching session, and then you already open your Q&A session, but your students really don't have any questions to ask to you, what would you do and what would you say? Do you have any tips, or what expressions or statements will you say to your students? And the last one will be, what are some other challenges identified in question 2. Together, brainstorm what would you do and say to help you overcome them. So after answering what would you do and what would you say, can you add another strategy to overcome or maybe prevent that kind of situation to happen again in your class? Well, I know that answering this question in section 2 will consume a lot of time because it requires us to reflect on our own experience, right, on what we have had so far in our classroom. So please take your time, and I hope that you don't skip this part because the reflections that you are writing in section number 2 here will help you to see yourself further. And then later when we are discussing the materials in this lecture, you can relate more to that. But whenever you're ready or when you're finished with those questions, let's move on to the next slide. And we are entering section 3 about mastering the mechanics of language. And we are focusing on functional language for delivering a teaching demonstration. Here are some useful expressions that you can use in various parts of your talk for classroom teaching or for delivering a teaching demonstration. So it can be both, okay? So the real teaching and teaching demonstration as part of a job talk. So teaching demonstration is also a job talk because we do teaching demonstration when we're applying for a job, right? Modify or add any expressions of your own to suit your communicative purposes. The mechanics are introduced in this unit because you will have only one chance to deliver a teaching demo at each institution when you have been invited for an interview. So we only have one chance to prove our teaching ability, to showcase our skill in teaching. So we need to make most of this opportunity, right? So we need to make sure that we master whatever it's needed to nail that demo. As such, it's important that you plan and practice what you will say, not to only make your teaching of the content memorable and effective. For example, by applying the strategies for enhancing clarity of explanations introduced in the previous unit, but also to create an impression of being polished and smooth in your linking and delivery of the important key points in various sections of your teaching sessions. So the skill, the methods of language needed to succeed the teaching demo or our teaching is not only from this lecture, but it's also about need to be complemented with the material from the previous unit or the previous lectures, especially about enhancing clarity of explanations, how to handle questions, how to handle the challenging questions. So they are all related. Okay, let's start the functional language for delivering a teaching demonstration. And it will start from the very beginning of a lecture, which is about the introduction of our lecture. So when we need to deliver introduction of our lecture, there are several steps. And the first one is to greet your class, to greet our class. Before I reveal useful phrases that we can use to greet our class, let me ask you one question. What expressions do you think we can use to greet our class? Or how do you usually greet your class? What do you say? What expressions do you say? Write down at least 5 expressions, different expressions that you use. If you haven't had any experience in teaching, then can you recall your memory when your lecturers or your teachers greet your class? What did they say? Write it down on the left side of slide 11 or in your notebook. If you're done, I will reveal to you the useful phrases that we can use to greet our class. Please repeat after me. Good morning. How's everyone today? Good. Or you can modify it with good afternoon, good evening. So it really depends on the time and situation. I only have one example because it's very easy to be modified, right? Now, can you add your own expressions? Please modify it. Make your own expressions to greet your students in the class. What will you say? All right, so after greeting our class, our next step is warming up our class or make announcements. So it's like when we are working out, we start with warming up, right? We need to warm up to be able to do the core activities well, right? So we need to warm up our class, warm up our students so that when we invite them to join us in the main menu, the main activities of the lesson, they're ready like that. Let me start with asking you these questions. What expressions do you think we can use to warm up our class or to make announcements? It's very impossible to, just open, greet our students, and then jump into the main menu or the main activities of our lesson, right? We need to do warm up. So how do you usually start your lesson before going to the core activities? Or you can answer these questions with what expressions can be said or what can we do? Or what do you usually do to warm up your class or to make announcements? You're finished? Now let's see the usable phrases that we can use to warm up our class and make announcements. Repeat after me. Let's begin by taking a look at, for example, let's begin by taking a look at the list of vocabulary in this chapter, for example, or the list of key terms or terminology that we need for our activities later. So many things. The warm-up stage itself can also be an ice breaking for your students. So in the beginning of the class, they usually are still, their thoughts, their mind are still wandering around, right? So they're still thinking many different things. So in this very stage, it's our time as teachers, as lecturers to direct their focus on the lesson. So that's why we need warm up or ice breaking to help them focus on the topic that we are going to discuss. Next one, repeat after me. Are we ready to start? Good. First of all, let me remind you of the rules of the game for today. Next one, before we move on to today's topic, let me make a few important announcements. Good. Before I introduce today's agenda, are there any questions related to what we covered last week? Yeah, so in the very last expressions that I wrote here, so it serves two purposes. First, to warming up the class, and number two, to having a short review about what was covered in the previous meeting, right? And you can also use this stage to review the previous meeting material. Now it's your turn. What are other expressions that we can use to warming up our class or make announcements? Write it down on the right side of slide 12. Take your time. make sure that you're finished first with the adding your own expressions part before moving to the next slide. Whenever you're finished, let's move on to the next stage of introduction of our lecture. It's about to introduce the subject and topic. So after we greet our students and warm them up, it's our time to introduce the subject of topic of the lesson. Okay, let me ask you to reflect on what you have done so far. So how do you introduce a learning subject or topic? Do you use special expressions? Or what else do you do to introduce the subject or topic? Do you use any game? Do you use any quiz, or what kind of activities? So many things that we can use to introduce a topic. Maybe watching a video, or you distribute a flashcard, or maybe printouts, or giving them a a handout maybe, or a story, just to help your students find out the topic or the subject of the lesson. So what do you usually do? And then what do you usually say to introduce the subject or topic of your lesson? All right, so here are the useful phrases that we can use to introduce the subject or topic of our lesson, and please repeat after me. Today's lecture will focus on, good. Today we are going to talk about, good. This morning we are going to look at, in this lab I plan to cover, good. Today, let's explore the answers to 3 questions that are often asked about. Yes. As a continuation of what we talked about last week concerning X, the focus of today's lecture is on. So this phrase is like building a bridge between what's learned in the previous meeting and what is going to be learned in the current meeting, right? So building a bridge. So we as the teachers try to provide the connection between the material of the previous meeting and the material of today's meeting. Next one. In the last class we examined, today we will spend the first half of the class on, and then we will turn to. All right, so some of the phrases here are quite long, but it doesn't mean that you need to exactly use word per word. You can still modify it, or use different diction to be used to introduce the subject or topic of your lesson. Now it's your turn. What can you add? What expressions can you add to introduce the subject of topic of your lesson? Add at least 2, but if you can come up with more than 2, that will be way better. In adding your own expressions, you can create a very brand new expression, or you can modify. So there are a lot of expressions there, right, in here. So you can modify some of them with your own diction, with your own wordings, right, and then write it down in here. So it doesn't always mean that you need to create brand new expressions. All right, when you're done, let's move on to slide 14. And the next step in the introduction of our lecture is to give instructions about questions. So the occurrence of questions asked by our students doesn't mean that they are not listening to us or they are not paying attention to our lecture. It is really the opposite. When they're asking questions, they're actually showing a proof that they are processing the information we are delivering, right? They are in the process of, saving the knowledge in their mind. because they are just being presented with new material like that, for example, and then there will be questions. So they are trying to, making sure that their understanding is correct, or whether or not they have clearly or entirely understood the material. So we really expect the occurrence of questions in our teaching, right? But we need to regulate that so that the occurrence of questions from various students won't disrupt the flow of our teaching. Instead, it will be placed at the right time. So although they have a lot of questions, it won't disturb our teaching flow or our teaching activities. So how about you first? In your experience, how do you give instructions about your questions in the class? Do you ask your students to keep the questions until the end of your material delivery, or you just let them ask questions anytime during your teaching process? All right, I'm going to show you a useful phrase that we can use to give instructions about questions. Repeat after me. If you have any questions, please feel free to stop me and ask me to repeat or clarify anything I say. This phrase means the teacher is allowing the students to ask questions anytime during the teaching process, right? So the teacher doesn't ask the students to hold their questions until the end of the teaching delivery, like that. So how about you? Do you do the same thing, or do you do something differently? Do you do it differently? Now, please add your own expressions in the way you give instructions about questions to your class. And this is going to be the last step in the introduction of your lecture. All right, let's move on to the next one. Functional language for delivering a teaching demonstration, but now it's about the body of your lecture. So we already covered the steps in the introduction or in the real opening of our lecture. Now let's see what to do, what to say for the body of our lecture. And the first step in here is to signal transitions between sections. So in our teaching, especially if our class is long, there will be a lot of sections, right? A lot of sections. So how to give a clear signal transition between sections so our students won't be confused? Let me start by asking you to reflect on your experience first. What do you say to your students when you want to move to the next sections of your teaching? How do you usually signal them? What do you usually say? What do you usually do? Write down at least three different things, or three different expressions. There are many ways to give the signal transitions between sections. Which ones do you usually use? If you haven't had any teaching experience, then in your classroom, how do your lecturers usually signal transitions between sections? Okay, now let's find out the useful phrases that we can use to signal transition between sections. Repeat after me. Next, let's move on to, good. Turning now to section number 3, which is about blah, blah, blah. Now, I'd like to shift our attention to, good. The first issue leads us to the second issue about, right? So far, we have discussed blah, blah, blah. Next, I want to focus on, so far, we have considered blah, blah, blah. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to, good. Next one. Now that we understand X, let us begin to consider Y. Good. Before moving on to the next category, let me give one more example. Before going on to the next point, are there any questions? Good. Let's go on to the next aspect of. Yes. So that explains the procedure, but what benefits does it have? Yes. Using rhetorical questions as transitions. Where does this leave us? Where do we go from here? What can we expect from this? Yes, so you can ask those kinds of rhetorical questions. Where does this leave us? Where do we go from here? And what can we expect from this? A lot of examples, right? Let me show you once more. We have 1, 2, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, more than 12. Now, please add your own expressions. What are other statements that we can use to signal transitions between sections in our teaching? Pause this video on slide 16, okay, to give yourself time to answer this question. Whenever you're ready, whenever you're finished, let's move on to the next step of the body of your lecture, which is about to illustrate. To illustrate. Do you give illustration in your teaching? How do you usually do that? Illustration or examples to make your explanation clearer, or you provide a context or a real example of real implementation of your material so that your students won't be confused. Okay, and here are some useful phrases. Please repeat after me. For example, for instance, good. Take the case of, and then you provide the examples or the story that shows the implementation of the theory you just explained, for example. Next one. As an illustration, good. In this case, in another case, good. To demonstrate, to illustrate. Let me give you an example to show. Good. Let me give you an example to show how this theory is applied in a classroom teaching, for example. It's now your time. Add your own expressions here. Again, you can modify the expressions above, or you can make your own. Or you can write down the expressions that your lecturers use to give illustration when teaching your class. Okay, next one. We have functional language to repeat or paraphrase. My question is, in what situation do we teachers need to repeat or paraphrase our explanation? And how do you usually do that? In what case, in what context, in what kind of situation paraphrasing or repeating our explanation is needed? And how do you usually do that? And the useful phrases for this are, repeat after me. That is, in other words, good. As I said earlier, as I mentioned earlier, good. Let me put it another way. Let me repeat that again because the concept is very important. Yes, so in the last phrase here, the answer of the questions on the left side is shown. So when we have theories or maybe a new knowledge for our students that are very important, or information that are very important, or very complex to understand by the students, we need to paraphrase that. We need to paraphrase our explanations. We need to repeat our explanation just to make sure that our students get it. Right. Now it's your turn to add your own expressions. What will you say to repeat or paraphrase your explanations when teaching. Whenever you're ready, let's move on to the next subsection, which is to emphasize points, still under the body of your lecture. Emphasizing points or highlighting points. Well, we may think that all the things inside our teaching are important, but there must be several points that are way more important than other points, right? And we need to emphasize them. So in what situation do we teachers need to emphasize our explanation? And how do you usually do that? Or how do you usually emphasize points in your teaching? You can answer it by addressing what to say and what to do. And the usable phrases are, repeat after me. The main thing is, more important than this is, notice the differences between X and Y. Good. Let me say it again that. Good. The key point is, it's important to emphasize at this point that this is the most crucial step in the process. So that's a question that commonly appears on tests. Because it appears frequently on tests, so that means that's very important point that we need to emphasize, right? Your turn now at your own expressions. What will you say to emphasize points in your teaching? Right, next one. Still about the body of your lecture, let's move on to the expressions to check understanding of our students. Let's start with the questions about you. In what situations do we teachers need to check our students' understanding, and how do you usually do that? Again, if you haven't had any experience in teaching, you can answer you can big change the questions into this way. How will you check the understanding of your students? What expression will you use, or what will you do? Or you can also address this question this way. From your experience of being students of your lecturers or professors, how do they usually check your understanding, or you and your friends' understanding when learning in the class? Okay, now let's see the usable phrases that we can use to check the understanding of our students. Repeat after me. Are there any questions so far? Good. Is everyone clear on the key components of? Good. Is everyone still with me? Good. Is this clear to everyone? A few of you look confused. Would you like me to explain that again? Yes. Checking understanding, making sure that the students are with us. Maybe just in case some students are left behind. We are already in section 4, but our students are still in section 3. So we need to check their understanding and making sure that everyone in the class is with us. Now your turn at your own expressions. What will you say to check the understanding of your students? Okay, let's move on to the next subsection. Still about the body of your lecture, but the next one will be to postpone questions. So previously, it's about how to handle questions or to give instruction about asking questions in the class, right? But at some points, in a certain situations, we need to postpone questions because of several reasons. Maybe we don't want to cut the flow of the learning activities, or maybe due to several other reasons, right? What do you think first? Why do you think we need to postpone questions asked by our students in our classroom teaching? In what kind of situation do you think we need to do this? In what kind of particular situation we need to postpone questions, although we really expect questions from our students, but we need to postpone answering the questions for a while. Please describe the situations on the right side of your slide 21. You can also answer that question with what will you say to postpone questions from students. And here is the example of the phrase that we can use to postpone questions. So repeat after me. That's a great question. You are slightly ahead of us. Good. I'll be coming to your question in about 5 minutes. I will mention that to you when we get there. Yes, so in this phrase, we know that sometimes we need to postpone questions when the students are already ahead of us. For example, we're still discussing a material in section 3, but our students ask a question related to material in section 4. So we need to postpone the questions, hold the questions for a while, and we will come back to that question, or come back to the students to answer that question when we finally reach section 4, for example, right? Now, please modify that expression or make your own expression to postpone questions from our students. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so this is the end about what to say and what to do in the functional language for delivering a teaching demonstration for the body of your lecture. Right, so the introduction and then the body, and the next one we are going to find out how to provide the conclusions of our lecture in section 3.3. All right, now we enter 3.3, still about functional language for delivering a teaching demonstration, and it is the last step, which is the conclusion of your lecture. So we have covered how to provide the introduction, and then to fill in the body of our lecture, and the last one is to conclude our lecture before we close the class, right? And there are several steps as we had in the previous sections. Let's start it from to provide a note of finality. I will start by asking you a question. How do you usually signal that your teaching session is about to end? How do you provide the signal? What do you say? What will be the clue that you give to your students? Because we cannot suddenly just end the class like without preparing our students to end the class, right? Or just suddenly stop the teaching like that. It won't be appropriate as well. So how do you usually signal that your teaching session is about to end? Or if you haven't had any teaching experience, you can answer this by taking a look at how your lecturers or your professors that you have met so far usually give you signal that the teaching session is about to end. Write down at least 5 different things, different points, different statements for this. Okay, now let's see the useful phrase that we can use to provide a note of finality. Repeat after me. Let me briefly summarize what we have covered today. Okay, we've considered the 3 points, that is X, Y, and Z. Good. Next week we will. The question that I'd like you to think about is, okay, so this is one package, right? From let me briefly summarize or let me briefly recap until the question that I'd like you to think about is. So when we hear our lecturer or professor or teacher saying these statements, we know that the class is about to end, about to finish, right? And we are going to meet again in the next lecture like that. And do you have another expressions that can be used to provide a note of finality? Okay, so after providing a note of finality, the next step is to invite questions, right? How do you usually do that? How do you usually invite or encourage your students to provide questions to you? What do you say? Or you can answer it by describing what can you do to invite questions from students. Here are the useful phrases that we can use to invite questions from our students. Repeat after me. Before I get to others' questions, let me try to answer the question X raised earlier. Good. Now, are there any questions? Next one. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Are there any final questions? Right. Now, modify this question, not questions, modify those expressions, or you can make your own. Please add your own expressions to invite questions. Moving on next, how to deal with questions after your lecture. This means how to handle questions that are asked not during your teaching session, but after your lecturing session. How do you handle questions from your students after your teaching session? So after the class is dismissed, everyone already leaves, but then one or two students come to you and ask questions. So how do you handle that kind of situation or those questions? Okay, and this is the example of the phrase that we can use to deal with questions after our lecture. Repeat after me. I can talk right now because I have to rush to a meeting, but I'd be glad to see you day after this time or during my office hours. Good. I'd be happy to discuss the assignment with you, but I have another appointment in 10 minutes. Why don't we schedule an appointment to do that? Good. So it's okay to not to, accommodate the questions from our students after the lecture if we really have an appointment after that, or we need something else to do after our lecture. As long as we communicate it with our students and try to help them set an appointment with us so that they can ask anything they need to ask after the lecture. Next one. I have a scheduled event to attend right after this lecture, but I would be very happy to discuss your question after time today. Would the time be suitable for you? Yes, so we over a certain date and time, right? Next one. I have another talk to deliver across the campus. Would you like to walk with me? Then we can talk about your questions if that arrangement works for you. All right. So the example of the phrases that I just provided are giving us various ways to respond to questions after our lecture, right? The last phrase is about entertaining the questions, but also at the same time walking to another place, because we as the lecturer need to be in another side of the campus, right? or we can also propose a certain time when we are available for our students and many others. So it's always okay not to directly answer the questions from our students after our lecture, especially if we have had appointment after that. And I believe that our students will understand that too. Now your turn at your own expressions. How will you deal with the questions after your lecture? What will you say? All right, ladies and gentlemen, so this is the end of section 3 about functional language for delivering a teaching demonstration. Let me repeat it again. In 3.1, it's about the introduction of our lecture. In section 2, it's the body of our lecture, and in section 3.3 it's about the conclusion of our lecture. So opening, the body, and the closing, right? So that's about the mechanics of the language, right? We have done with section 3 with the mechanics of language. The next one, we are going to see the challenges and strategies for teaching demonstration, and we will focus more on tips for overcoming speech anxiety. What can we do to overcome that? Let's find out. Challenges and strategies for teaching demonstration, tips for overcoming speech anxiety. Yes, we all know that it's easier said than done. Easier said than done, always. But here are the top practical tips gathered from colleagues and students that you can apply to overcome potentially debilitating anxiety. Never expect any strategy to work smoothly and magically the first time you apply it, and that's okay. It's even okay to fail in the first trial, in the first experience, that's okay. As long as we acknowledge our failure, we reflect on it, and we, construct strategy for our next teaching session. Experiment with different strategies at least a few times to find the routine that works the most effectively for you in overcoming speech anxiety. So we need to experiment. Sometimes the strategy works in class A, but not in class B or the other way around. So we need to do more experiment in implementing different strategies. All right. And here are the tips. Number 1, do our homework. What is that? What does that mean? Nothing is going to beat prior planning, preparation, and practice. Rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Although we have several sessions of teaching, we need to rehearse whenever we need. And when we have had enough planning, preparation, and even practice, we can reduce our speech anxiety. The key is in our preparation. Because when we have more preparation, we become more familiar with our talk. And when we are more familiar with our talk, we will have more confidence and we will be less panic when we are presenting or in the show time. Number 2, save yourself from unnecessary panicking. Unnecessary panicking. So it means that the panicking that we can actually prevent before it happens. Save yourself from having your mind go blank. Prepare supporting material, for example, visual aids, note cards, or scripts, to keep yourself from going blank or losing your composure. Always have a plan B for everything. For example, saving multiple backup copies of your slides. And if any unforeseen disaster strikes, remain calm and proceed with plan B or seek help. Well, sometimes we think that we have done enough preparation, or we have prepared plan B, but sometimes even plan B won't work. And sometimes we need to prepare plan C on the spot or spontaneously. What we need to do is to remain calm. So handle ourselves, don't show that we are panicking, because when we feel panic, then we will distract our mind to think of the new solution, right? But we can overcome that by, saving multiple backup copies, or have more spare materials like that, or spare copies like that, just to make sure that we can overcome any possible issues. Number 3, memorize the first 120 seconds. What does it mean? Know the introduction like the back of your head so that you can start the presentation on a strong note, feeling confident. Remember that the first impression is very important, especially if we meet a new audience or new students in a new classroom. So to help us not to go blank in the beginning of our teaching session or talk session, we can memorize the first statements that we need to say in the beginning of our talk. When the opening is over, the butterflies will dissipate. So sometimes the feeling nervous is just in the beginning of it. When we already nail the opening, nail the introduction, the rest will be just fine. Things usually get better as you go along. Yes. Number 4, think positively and visualize your success. So we need to set our mind to the success of our talk or the success of our teaching. See yourself as a polished and professional. Remember that your audience wants you to succeed, and no one is interested in spending time listening to a bad talk. So we need to think positively, not negatively. No one is willing to attend a bad talk. So everyone in the audience expects us to deliver something good. Avoid black and white thinking that there are only 2 outcomes. For example, complete success or complete failure. No. Well, maybe some parts of our teaching or some parts of our talk may be considered as a failure because they didn't really go smoothly, but please avoid black and white thinking. It's either complete success or complete failures. Although 1 or 2 small failures happens in our talks, that's still okay. We still have a lot of chances and opportunities to fix that in the next session of our talk or teaching, right? Number 5, check out the location. If possible, it's not always possible if the conference location is overseas, for example, and arrive early, or if the teaching demonstrations is in a new location that you have never been before. So check out the locations, arrive early so that you have spare time to prepare your mind, to prepare your heart, and not to, to feel the rush, because when we feel we are in a rush, we will easily get panic. Number 6, dress professionally and comfortably so that you don't find yourself adjusting what you're wearing every 2 minutes, every 2 minutes like this, every 2 minutes like this. That will be disturbing to our audience. Number 7, get your gears ready. Before your talk, drink some water for dry mouth. If there is no water anywhere, try gently chewing your tongue to create saliva. Finally, exercise your mouth muscles, much like the warm-up you would do before a sports game or exercise. So if you know that you're about to attend or give a talk or teaching demonstrations, please be aware, know that we will use a lot of our mouth and throat, right? And they can get dry easily. So prepare some water. And before the talk begins, before the teaching demo begins, make sure that we are well hydrated. Number 8, make the butterflies work for you. Recognize that a modest amount of nervousness, the so-called facilitative anxiety, can help you to convey your message with energy and enthusiasm. So anxiety doesn't always mean bad, but when we can make most of it, it can convey our message with good enthusiasm and positive energy. Number 9, take a few deep breaths. Try slowing down your heart rate by breathing in through the nose, expanding the diaphragm with relaxed shoulder, holding your breath for 5 seconds by tightening your stomach muscles, fists and toes, and then exhaling through your mouth, releasing all tension. So we don't need to speak in a rush, right? Especially when we know we have enough time to present our teaching demonstration or talk. So relax our muscles and repeat this at least a few times. The last one, gain experience. Experience builds confidence. Listen to others present and pursue opportunities to speak or present. Practice where you can, when you can, and try to respond to what people say to you. Any practice is good, whether you speak to someone who is a native English speaker or not. Next one. Do you have any other personal tips to share in overcoming speech anxiety? Have you asked others about their tips? Maybe your friends have another tips that you have never known before. You might also consider asking other presenters whom you admire about their tips for overcoming speech anxiety, or senior presenters that you think they have a lot of poise and confidence when presenting. And I want you to add your own tips here. Can you add some more tips that haven't been listed in the tips for overcoming speech anxiety? Your speaking partner, your friends may need it too, right? So add your own tips here. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of lecture 11 about teaching demonstration. I hope that all the materials today can help you better prepare your teaching demonstrations or even the real teaching, right? And the next one, we are having lecture 12, which is the last lecture for English for Academic Communication. So I'm so happy to accompany you learning English for Academic Communication. And I'll see you in our last lecture, lecture 12. I'm Maria Dewi Rosari from Jakarta International University. I'll see you in our last lecture.